Howdy of you delicious people. I am here roughly a month later to talk to you about 28 days later. The one thing that in my mind I'm thinking of, like, why 28 days? Like, is there some kind of, like, scientific thing that if a zombie apocalypse were to have actually happened, it would take roughly 28 days to widely spread this thing, if it were to actually happen? Is there some mathematical thing behind that? Like, what is up with the 28 days? Is this just a random number? Did somebody just like the name 28 days? Couldn't they have just called this roughly a month later? Couldn't they have called it like 21.24 days later? So that way I can just be an a-hole and just complain about the date of a movie, or just the title of a film, I mean. Because I am just, like, I've heard worse movie titles, let's just say that. So going into this, like, I think immediately when people are to see the show Walking Dead and to see this movie, a lot of people will probably make comparisons to the two, that it'll feel drastically similar. We, of course, probably won't see a naked guy laying in a, in a medical bed. But, like, hey, like, we wouldn't see that on The Walking Dead. But, man, would we see something pretty dang close. So, going into this film, I think the one complaint that I have to make about this movie forcibly, and there might be more than one, is the fact that, one, this movie is so slow. It's really just so slow, and it's like 2 hours, and I'm like, man, this is just... If there is a movie to fall asleep on, it would possibly be this one. We also have it to where every zombie part of this film is done far too quickly. There's not much to marinate on there. And there's not enough zombie parts in this film. Like, I would have loved it if there was to seemingly be more zombie parts to this film. Everything is done too quickly. All the action scenes are done far too quickly. And there is just to be this kind of going on for this film. But yeah, so with that said, though, I think there's an interesting journey that these characters are to head into. And I think eventually when we start to meet more and more people, and eventually where this story eventually turns and twists and twines and whatever, it creates for a very interesting overall movie. I would actually say, if they're going to do this the long stretching way, like, I'm surprised that this movie wasn't to be regurgitated out into some series. Like, with Day of the Dead kind of being a series right now, and man, are they stretching the crap out of that show, you would think that 28 Days Later would eventually just have become like a show at some point, because that would have made just a lot of sense to just kind of break that down and give us that kind of show, because they can do the show however they really want to. They can still focus on certain things in certain kind of ways that that the, of course, original source material kind of does things, but they could also probably invent a lot. They can also inject a lot of things to kind of fill up time a lot more, with there not being so much dead space in a movie like this that is 2 hours. Or maybe they can just remake this movie and just kind of cut the fat a little bit, so to speak. So what is what would be my grading system for this movie? Like, I would say that this probably has to be, like, I don't know, I have this kind of hesitation, about wanting to say this is an okay film. Like I want to say that it's kind of like it's something to watch. Like it's something to watch. And I feel horrible kind of saying that because I want to give it a higher grading than that. So I'll say that this movie is to be a okay film. Uh, Go ahead and check it out if you have 2 hours to kill. Some people might have the exact same kind of complaints that I probably will, which is understandable. Or really, people will just like this film. Or maybe people will say that, hey, man, check out the sequel. The sequel is better, or whichever. Which I had, I think, seen the kind of the early beginning of the sequel movie, but then I realized that, oh, there's 28 days later because I didn't know the difference. I think when I was to be working at some point in time, I think they released 28 weeks later, so I didn't know there was like another beforehand movie of that. So, with that said, the teen version of this movie is. Let's go into that. So, we have a character who is to be this guy named Jim, that is to seemingly have awoken up during uh, a zombie apocalypse, but can't really tell it's much of a zombie apocalypse because really there's so much wide open dead space everywhere. You could never tell that there was seemingly any zombies anywhere until roughly a good portion of film. Um, when this guy is just kind of in every single one of these places, in a hospital, out in the streets, going and just shopping around, eventually going and finding like what new fleece is on sale. Fleece? Anyways, so Jim is to eventually bump into these two other people that make him decide that he wants to go back home. And once he ends up going back home, he ends up going and kind of regathering himself, and eventually is now forced to head back into other locations to try to find either more people or just to try to find more scavenging items, because eventually they're just trying to look for the best place to live the longest in. Because these zombies are quick. These zombies are quick, and of course they are enraged by chimpanzee illness. Chimpanzee virus. The chimpanzee biting virus. Because that's actually what happens. That's how this whole thing spurs off. Like almost like Outbreak, weirdly. Instead of it being like some kind of thing that like gets everyone sick, it all of a sudden turns everybody into these rage monsters that start to kill people. So this is kind of like the one movie Mayhem with the guy from Glenn from The Walking Dead. I think that was done in like 2017 or something like that. Yeah, it feels like Mayhem. Whatever. So, which I just kind of like, I find that funny because I'm like, oh my god, like this feels like Mayhem weirdly. Anyways, so eventually Jim is to stumble upon a guy named Frank and his daughter, and so these characters eventually go on to I believe his daughter's name is Hannah. This is so weird. Because I'm looking at the IMDb, and it's done in the way of which that people are to appear in the movie, and I'm like, I have never seen this done in my life. It's so weird how I'm kind of seeing like the movie like breaking down in the early stages, because most of the time I would just see like breakdown of like who's in the movie the most, who's in the movie the longest. not this approach. It's kind of just interesting. Um, so, uh, so eventually, these people go ahead and decide that they need to go somewhere else because eventually, like, they're going to run out of resources. So, like, it just kind of keeps going to this kind of like hopping from place to place to place to place. And there are certain interesting scenes that are to develop through this film that there's certain kind of spots that you can enjoy in this film. Um, but then again, you're also just like, but man, those long stretches of the long stretches of things. But a lot of people would probably say that this movie is visually interesting. I think could be the real consensus also from this film. Um, yeah, it's probably just a lot of just people looking out onto certain places or whatever, and but still, like it is kind of visually interesting when you really break it down. If you're gonna just break it down, break it. Anyways, so pushing on. So I think that's all that I have to say in the teeing up like fashion of 28 days. Eventually, Jim and whoever is left of his people to try to make it seem like there's not a certain kind of people that live at the end of this. Eventually, when Jim and his people are to end up with these military guys, it seems like these military guys have some weird or strange goals in mind, and eventually there is to be an interesting ending coming out of this. But again, I'm going to try to kind of keep it close to the vest as humanly possible for when we get to spoilers. So, with that said, I'm going to go out of my way to say that it's about the customary time yet again to go into that thing called the double five time territory because it is spoiler time. It's about the time we spoil this movie. Man, I remember when the cryptic version of these episodes used to only be 5 minutes long. I don't know why I'm going into like the movie even further and what I guess a lot of times because I probably have these like long stretch of movies where I feel like I have like something to say more often than whatever. But I don't know. Let's go into it. Let's go into spoilers. So very beginning of this, so this movie in some aspects does feel like Brain Dead. If you've ever heard of the Peter Jackson movie Brain Dead, go ahead and check out this movie. Oh, also, I guess before we go, where can you go to see this movie? It's on HBO Max right now, so go ahead and check it out there. Before we get into spoilers, because some people are like, well, hey, where could I see this movie? And it's on HBO Max right now. The first one is, the second one evidently isn't. You can probably go out of your way into several apps like Fox HD Movies if you don't have HBO Max, or if you want to watch 28 Weeks later. You can probably find it there, or possibly I've been using a bunch of other random apps that I'm not quite sure have this movie. You can probably go into, if you're going to have Google Play, go on to an app called TV Crush to see if this movie is on there. You could probably also go into a Google search and to look for an app called Letter C Movies. So C Movies. And you can basically see a number of things through that app. Basically have an unlimited source to basically see anything. As well as there's there's an app inside of that app that is to be called like Yes Movies, and eventually you should be able to kind of see about the same roughly from C Movies as you would see Yes Movies. So whatever you want to do. But without further ado, let's get into spoilers. So, because I wanted to like say all that rigmarole before we get here. So now we're here. So, like I said, this kind of the beginning of this kind of feels like Peter Jackson's Brain Dead. So let's go into it. So the beginning of this, we have these scientists who are experimenting on all these chimpanzees, and so we end up having them weirdly in these like glass like cases. So I'm like, okay, that's kind of visually interesting, but it also looks like they have some kind of like weird like rat race of them going in these weird cages. It just seems weird. Um, so all of a sudden, all these activists, they have they have them in IMDb as activists, are to go in and try to free these monkeys, to free these apes, to free just like James Franco should just come in here and just be like, I'm gonna free as I say sign language stuff to the monkeys because they should know sign language, right? No. I'm sorry if I faked like sign language there. I don't know sign language besides like mother and father, but I don't even know which one it is. I'm a horrible person. So please, sign language people, please don't dislike this video or anybody who learns sign language. Whatever. Anyways, my apologies. So these activists go and get these monkeys out of these things, and we desperately have one scientist who's like, no, don't uncage these monkeys. They're full of rage. They're full of rage. They're going to go into a car and have road rage. Don't do it. These monkeys are desperately going to go and want to get into a car and just drive over people because monkey road rage. They're filled with rage. And so all of a sudden one chimpanzee ends up biting down on a woman. And so all of a sudden she's like, and they're like, oh my god, what's up with her? Is she now filled with the rage? And so yes, she is filled with the rage. So all of a sudden she ends up going and murdering and killing people because she is now a zombie. And so it also seems like you can, like, I don't know the possible way of killing this zombie in this movie. It seems that they end up shooting this one of the zombies multiple times in the chest. So is it like chopping off the head in this movie? Is it just like doing something with the head? Like what is the, like, if you smack the head hard enough, like, is that the way to kill the thing? Because they don't specify it in this movie, because the action sequences you can't really perfectly tell what's going on anyways. So I'm assuming you can just kill this zombie kind of in any normal way? Anyways, but these zombies are fast. That's the real takeaway. So God, what was I also going to say here? There was some, I don't know. Anyways, so we transition to 28 days later to eventually find this guy named Jim, eventually be laying just spread eagle, take me now, onto this bed. And so we can just see his, like, some twig and berries going on here. And because evidently, if I was in a hospital and I would just be like without clothes, I would be wanting to sue Happy somebody. Because I'd be like, what the fuck? I woke up without clothes on. What kind of garbage is this? So Jim all of a sudden is to get up and to start strolling around to find out that there's no one seemingly at this hospital. And I would be really kind of concerned because it seems like there's absolutely nobody here. Like it's as if they like tried to evacuate the town or whatever. Because I guess that's probably what they ended up doing. Whoever was kind of forcibly left last here was to basically just forcibly handle with the elements of things. So Jim makes his way and is to go like kind of all around town, just kind of seeing whoever's around town. I guess he ends going shopping and getting some fleece. He doesn't get any fleece. He gets this like weird tiny bag that I guess he's to just kind of eventually smack zombies with eventually when he is to see one of them. Because eventually Jim is to head to this church where all of a sudden it seems that he ends up going and finding some priest who ends up turning into a zombie. And so Jim is like, Father! And the zombie's like, Arr! And he's like, Father! And he's like, Arr! It's like, are you okay? And so Jim eventually takes his bag and smacks the priest over the head with this bag, which hopefully probably has a brick or two in it, because what else would this bag have in it? This priest ends up kind of falling over, and Jim is like, well, I guess I should get out of here. So eventually Jim just goes on to like continue to search around, and then eventually he ends up bumping into two people. I believe a character named Selena and Mark. So Selena and Mark are two. And if I didn't say it, it's kind of weird looking at this IMDb, because this IMDb perfectly sets up this movie. And I thought that that's so cool. I'm like, wow, the first ever time that it like perfectly sets up like where these people are to be in the film. And I thought that that was so cool. I'm like, wow, I wish that every movie would do like that. Because I don't know how many times we were seeing like one important person in the thing, and you're seeing them like all the way down to the very bottom of the IMDb, and you have to like scroll for a million years to eventually find one name that you're like, this is Steve. Oh, great, Steve. Yeah, thank God I had to go and find that for 2 seconds to kind of waste time. Anyways, so Jim, Selena, and Mark are to team up, and so they're to kind of tell him what's going on. Like at first, I think Mark is to say that, hey, like, Jim, since you're wearing scrubs, like, you must be a doctor. And Selena's like, that doesn't mean anything. He could have just been at a hospital. Like, and so Jim is like, yeah, I'm not a doctor. I was just some he was just some bike messenger. And he ended up getting knocked down, and went to the hospital, and he just awoke recently, not really knowing what's really going on. So eventually Jim, Selena, and Mark all decide that or Jim gets to kind of see like that there is a zombie outbreak happening, and so eventually Jim and these two people go to Jim's home, and they're immediately telling Jim, it's like, well, hey, like, brace for the fact that there might be like zombies in your home. And Jim's like, I get it, like, if anything, I just want to go back home to see if my parents are okay. So Jim eventually goes back into his house, and he ends up finding both of his parents, sadly, had taken their own lives by taking too much medication. And so all of a sudden, Jim's mother is to have this little picture of, I guess, a younger Jim. And so I guess also this ends up being a note for Jim in case he ends up coming back. Where on the back of this picture, it ends up having where they wrote a note saying like, hey Jim, we decided to just kind of like do what you're doing, and we decided to both sleep, and so hopefully you don't wake so we can rejoin you into the other world. And so Jim is now seeing this note, and he is just in tears because he's like, oh my god, like, my parents like thought that like we could rejoin together, uh, and they took their own lives. So I guess Jim's parents don't come back as zombies. So these guys are just hunkering down, eventually going and just kind of waiting it out. And so all of a sudden, in the middle of the night, because supposedly they are to have this rule to try to avoid going out at night as much as humanly possible, because more than likely you're going to die if you just try and hunker down. or try to not hunker down during the middle of the night. Like it's kind of like 7 Days to Die, where eventually the zombies weirdly get like faster at night. Uh, but really, it's like they're fast all the time. But weirdly, you just probably more than likely die at night than you would during the day. Anyways, so what ends up happening is zombies start crashing into Jim's home, and so eventually what happens is the group is trying to defend themselves, and sadly enough, Mark ends up getting scratched in the arm or possibly like bitten somehow. You would have thought, like, if money was no object and you could just find any number of things to kind of armor yourself during a zombie apocalypse, you would think that you would find all kind of like strategic outfits that you can wear so that you will never get bitten ever again, even though that's got to be sweaty as F. Like, still, you would think, like, dude, I'm going to be wearing like a surfer suit or whatever that's called, like a wetsuit. Like you would think that zombies would probably have a very difficult time trying to make him through that, or you would think you'd do the World War Z kind of defense where you would tape these like magazines to your arms, or like kind of I think Train to Busan kind of does the same thing, a little bit. You would think there would be some like I desperately want to see one strategic like zombie movie where somebody used to be decked out head to toe in like the most like gear you could possibly have. Like I think I ended up seeing Ving Rhames, the guy who is in the remake of Dawn of the Dead, the 2004 one. I also saw him in a zombie apocalypse movie called Zombie Apocalypse, and he was to do this, and like these people were like decked out in like all this sports equipment and catcher gear, and I was like, oh my god, like that is the smartest movie I've ever seen in my life, and nobody ever has recreated that kind of movie and that intelligence and that strategy. I guess eventually I'll probably eventually go on and review that movie sometime soon because I thoroughly enjoy that film. Maybe I might even do that today, but it'll more likely be tomorrow with kind of what I already have in mind kind of lined up. But I hope to kind of get that under my belt soon because I actually like that film. Anyways, pushing on. So Mark is to be infected, and so Selena just knifes him to death and kills him. And so Jim is like, what the fuck? And Selena's like, hey, like, if anybody ends up getting affected, you kill them right away. Like, don't hesitate, because eventually they're going to come at you and murder you. So, like, hey, if you're to turn, I am going to kill you just like I killed Mark without hesitation. Like, hey, it's his fault that he got freaking whatever. Like, he should have just... He should have went for the Brad Pitt magazine shoulder defense, but no. So now both Jim and Selena are to eventually just head out after this whole thing is to be kind of done and over with. And so they eventually start going and scavenging for food and trying to survive. So eventually what happens is they are to make it to this apartment complex. And so they start heading further and further up these stairs of this apartment complex, coincidentally to bump into this guy who is to be Frank, who weirdly has this like riot gear on, and he is to just kind of defend his keep with his kind of riot gear shield and stuff on, and just kind of club these zombies and to take them out. And so Frank then goes and is to like take off all of his like clothes and is to greet both these people and just be like, hey, this seems like a perfect time to celebrate, and so let's get some like alcoholic beverages and like let's just celebrate us meeting new people. Because the reason why both Selena and Jim were to see these people is they were walking on to all of a sudden see this one apartment complex lit up with Christmas tree lights. I guess to try and uh, make people think that there were to be people in that room. So, like, hey, we're going to try and head up there to see if there's anybody left alive so we can kind of partner up with them. So, that is, of course, when Jim decides to finally get a little trim on his head. And so Jim tries to shave his beard, and he ends up cutting his face pretty good. And Frank is like, "Well, I'm sorry, man. Like, we can't turn on the water. Like, we have to save it as much as we can. So I'm sorry I couldn't let you use water to just kind of do anything with cleaning yourself." And Jim is like, "Hey, man, it's fine. Like, it's okay. I understand." So, but yeah, so Jim ends up having to forcibly buzz cut the rest of his hair. He couldn't have gone with that sweet mohawk for the whole film. He couldn't have come up with a cool sweet hairstyle. No, he has to just buzz cut the whole thing. So eventually Frank is to eventually figured out that he is to come up with this little machine that is to eventually have this be this radio. And so they're to just kind of adjust to see if there's any radio stations left out there. And it seems that there is one that is to continue to broadcast this one repetitive message. And so they determine that they need to go to where this location is because they think that it's safety or to be safe there. So Frank is to say, okay, we need to go on a road trip to make it there. They are going into this car and they're going to try and make it there. And they're like, well, what if we die trying to get there? What if it takes too long? What if, what if any number of things happen? So eventually Frank is just well, yeah, but think of it on the opposite end of the coin of what if we're basically saved after we make it there? What if there's a larger number of people than we do have here? There was to be this one really interesting story that that Mark had, and so let me also kind of finish this up. Or no, I think that's kind of all and well finished. Let's go into the Mark story. So Mark had this interesting story where he was to eventually talk about kind of what had happened before everything all went to heck. Mark decided that he wanted him and his family to try and buy his way out of this city and eventually go to the airport and try to find the quickest plane out of there. And so eventually there was about a huge, massive amount of people that all came up with the same idea. And so all of a sudden this airport just ended up getting crowded with people. And so all of a sudden there was to be this zombie outbreak that happened in this airport. And so all of a sudden Mark had so many bodies that he was kind of just having to walk through and whatever, that eventually he couldn't tell the difference between a infected person and a non-infected person. So they were just kind of, I guess, climbing over bodies because I guess just freaking everybody was just kind of eventually just falling over one another and getting attacked and whichever. So that was kind of an interesting kind of story to I wish that they would have actually shown that piece, or kind of actually shown that kind of story happening. I thought that would actually be cool, or kind of give us since we have this moment anyways, kind of give us an understanding of who these people are so we could have invested in them. But yeah, So, uh, so now this group has decided to go and get all their stuff all together into this one small little car, and so they decide to go on and drive, and so eventually that forces them to eventually drive into this tunnel. And so all of a sudden, these people are to drive into this tunnel to eventually find that there is some like car pileup weirdly placed in this tunnel to. Let me pause here for a second. And we're back. So all of a sudden we have this kind of like weird this weird kind of car pileup that all of a sudden has it to where these characters are to have to kind of do this like weird ramp of a thing. And so Frank is like, well, we're just going to have to just drive on through this. Like, whatever this is, like, what are we going to have to do? We're just going to have to drive through this because we're going to have to just forcibly, like, because this is the only quickest way there to make it to this spot. So we have to go this way. So all of a sudden, this car is to create a flat tire. And so realize this now that, like, probably this car having to make it through this spot already created a lot of noise. And so now we have this car that has this flat tire. And so people are kind of scrambling to get this tire and put a new tire in. And so eventually we start to have a scrambling of zombies that are to appear in this tunnel. Luckily there wasn't already zombies in this tunnel, but so eventually the guys are to quickly put this tire on this car right as zombies were getting ever so close to this car. So they end up driving off, and so eventually they continue driving to eventually making it to this one location where they're just like, okay, like, where are all these people? Hopefully we're going to eventually find this military force sometime soon. They end up going and finding some tanker that is to have this gasoline. And so Frank ends up going and trying to, like, in his only way of getting gasoline, trying to suck up through a hose to try to get some gasoline, which I don't think they really got much out of that tanker. But yeah, so what ends up happening is Frank is to eventually see this crow, and so all of a sudden he's trying to shoot this crow because the crow is making too much noise. Evidently this crow is to be kind of nibbling at this zombie, and so Frank is trying to shoot this crow to all of a sudden have this one bit of blood end up going right into a part of his eye that is to eventually, I guess, go through his body. And so all of a sudden Frank is now telling his daughter that he loves her because he's assuming that he's going to turn into a zombie soon. And so all of a sudden, slowly but surely, he is to kind of turn into this zombie. And so eventually they end up having to go and like see Frank slowly but turn into a zombie, and all of a sudden this military force ends up coming in and shooting down Frank and killing him, sadly. So this military force ends up going and taking Jim and these two girls and heading to their base that seems to be well fortified. It seems like this location is to look like some kind of almost like prison kind of thing, but it just kind of looks also like a mixture of a prison and like just some mansion. And so we have this Major Henry West that is to seemingly be the of course the superior over everyone. So we have the Major Henry West, which a lot of people probably know him from probably Doctor Who or Probably at some point he ends up playing like the Invisible Man and like Heroes. Kind of a huge cluster of like a number of things that eventually this guy has been on at some point. Probably a lot of people would probably remember him as like one of the Doctor Who's. So kind of in the later seasons. So Henry West is to eventually kind of tell Jim kind of what's going on here. And so evidently one of the military guys end up turning into a zombie. And so Henry is to eventually tell Jim, it's like, well, yeah, we're going to try and like learn from this zombie and try to figure him out. Kind of see like what he wants and what he needs, and eventually if this zombie is to eventually have some kind of intelligence or something like that he could possibly learn any number of things, which it seems like he can't. So eventually Henry's to keep this zombie here, to also try to starve it out, to see how long it'll take a zombie to starve out before it dies. And if it never does, then I guess they figure that out too. So eventually what also Henry is to kind of tell Jim is that eventually these privates desperately like wanted some kind of hope for their future, because a lot of privates were going and taking guns to their own heads because they're just like, dude, like what is really left for us? And so eventually Major West is to tell Jim that the only way that the Major could kind of keep these privates sane is to basically have them go and eventually find females, so that way eventually these privates would have a female to eventually make a baby with, to eventually have these privates realize that they do have a future, that eventually they are going to eventually make it through this. And so, like, we end up finding out that these guys, who, when they finally have a female presence here, are kind of really taking advantage of it, and it just kind of becomes where Jim kind of has to save these women from this military force. But yeah, so we end up having also, like, the Major going and having, like, these guys, like, have certain projects to do to kind of keep them busy, or just to really just have a goal in mind, so that way it kind of keeps them chugging along. It seems that these zombies tend to consistently try and break through these people's kind of barriers and stuff, try and eventually force these guys to have to eventually kind of like shoot these zombies down numerous times at a night. So the Major is to mention that they have seemingly several different kind of mines and stuff like that, that eventually, if these zombies were to make their way down here, that eventually they would blow up, or really just they would trip on a number of things. So to make it to this facility, eventually they would get killed off. So, eventually we end up having Jim, who is to be forcibly separated from the girls when the guys are wanting these girls to go and dress in these fancy dresses, I guess to gear up for them probably having to be taken advantage of. So eventually they can produce a child. Eventually Jim is to try to save these girls, to eventually get knocked out and to basically be imprisoned. And so eventually Jim has to come up with a way to try to save these girls. And so he ends up having to now forcibly go and like have this kind of horn siren thing repetitiously go on to force a large amount of zombies to make their way to this barracks or to this place, this environment, to eventually go and take out all this military force. And then Jim is going to go and uh, eventually grab these women and try to get them to safety. So eventually, uh, Jim is to take these girls to a safe place, and they are to eventually go and create these big sheet-like things in a different location to eventually spell out the words help. And because it seems like there is a plane that is consistently flying by back and forth, and so evidently they are to put these sheets out, then ended up saying the word help. And so I guess this plane, is to fly down and eventually go and help them. Is assuming how this movie is to eventually just play out or is to end or whichever. So hopefully I covered most of this movie. I think when especially we got to the end, I kind of rushed through it because really for most of this movie, it's like there's a lot of stretching and a lot of just like getting certain environments and whatever that are to be showcased here, and that's about it. So I think with that said, I think that's all that I wanted to say about this movie. And hopefully people enjoyed this review, or maybe got, like, if they never have heard of this movie before, eventually like, oh yeah, I remember something about this film, but I didn't know what it was. Or there are probably also like huge fans of this movie also, and maybe to them this might be their favorite zombie film for whatever reason. Maybe it's just the environment. Maybe it's just the fact that it's a zombie invasion that ends up happening in a certain location, and people might be happy about that because that would be perfectly representative of so and so, whatever. So, with that said, I think that's all I wanted to say about 28 Days Later. Maybe if this movie is interesting enough to a lot of people, maybe I will go and do the sequel. Not quite sure, because who knows? Maybe no one will have cared about these movies, because that's the usual thing. But it seems that a lot of people like zombie movies for whatever reason. So, anyways, I'm going to get out of here. Bye, everybody. Bye, everybody.